The bitter March wind cut through the rubble-strewn streets of Waldenburg as Friedrich Koller stood paralyzed in his doorway, his calloused hands gripping the splintered wood frame so tightly his knuckles had turned white. March 28, 1945, would forever burn itself into his memory as the day everything he had been taught about the American enemy revealed itself to be a carefully constructed lie. What the young GI was offering to his 8-year-old son, Hans, would shatter 12 years of Nazi indoctrination in a single, impossible moment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The 41-year-old blacksmith watched in stunned disbelief as Sergeant Timothy O'Brien of the 90th Infantry Division knelt down in the muddy street, his olive-drab uniform still bearing the dust of recent combat, and extended a bar of Hershey's chocolate toward the wide-eyed boy. Hans, whose ribs showed clearly through his threadbare shirt after months of increasingly meager rations, hesitated behind his father's protective stance. The child had not tasted chocolate in over 2 years, not since before the Allied bombing had intensified and luxury items had vanished entirely from German civilian life. "For the boy," Sergeant O'Brien said in a heavily accented but understandable German, his weathered face breaking into a gentle smile that seemed impossibly genuine for someone who, according to everything Friedrich had been told for over a decade, should have been a barbaric invader bent on destroying German families. The American soldier, who couldn't have been more than 23 years old, reached into his field pack and produced not just 1 chocolate bar, but 3 more, along with a tin of condensed milk and a packet of crackers that looked fresher than anything Friedrich had seen in months. This moment of incomprehensible generosity was occurring in the small Bavarian town of Waldenburg, where American forces had arrived just hours earlier after a surprisingly brief engagement with retreating Wehrmacht units. The town's 2,847 residents had spent the previous weeks in a state of terror, having been repeatedly warned by Nazi officials that the approaching Americans would show no mercy to German civilians. Party propaganda had painted vivid pictures of American soldiers as ruthless killers who would execute men, assault women, and steal whatever meager possessions remained after years of total war. Friedrich's own experience seemed to mock these warnings at every turn. Instead of the savage conquerors he had been conditioned to fear, he found himself facing a young man who was treating his son with a kindness that defied comprehension. The sergeant's uniform was clean and well-maintained, his equipment appeared new and abundant, and his demeanor suggested not the desperate brutality of a struggling army, but the confidence of forces operating with overwhelming resources and clear moral purpose. "Papa, can I take it?" Hans whispered in German, his voice barely audible above the rumble of American vehicles moving through the town square. The boy's eyes remained fixed on the chocolate bar with the intensity of someone who had forgotten such luxuries even existed. Friedrich found himself unable to respond, caught between years of conditioning that warned against accepting anything from enemy soldiers and the undeniable reality of his son's desperate hunger. The sight of his child's malnutrition was a daily reminder of how drastically life had deteriorated under the pressures of total war. Hans had been a robust, healthy 6-year-old when the conflict began. Now, at 8, he weighed less than many 5-year-olds, his growth stunted by chronic malnutrition and the stress of constant air raids. The boy's mother, Friedrich's wife, Anna, had died 6 months earlier during a bombing raid on nearby Regensburg, where she had been standing in line for bread rations. Friedrich had been left to care for Hans alone, while maintaining his essential work at the town's forge, which had been converted to producing simple tools and repairs for the increasingly desperate German war effort. Sergeant O'Brien seemed to understand the father's hesitation without need for explanation. "It's safe," he said, his pronunciation of German words careful and deliberate. "Good chocolate, American chocolate." He broke off a piece and ate it himself, a gesture that spoke to a level of cultural sensitivity that Friedrich had never expected from the supposedly crude American forces. The action was simple, but it carried profound implications. Here was an enemy soldier not only offering food to a German child, but taking steps to reassure a frightened father about its safety. The psychological impact of this moment extended far beyond the immediate transaction. Friedrich had spent the last 12 years accepting increasingly elaborate explanations for why Germany's enemies possessed certain advantages. When American bombers first appeared over German cities in large numbers, he had been told that this was a temporary situation, that German production would soon outpace American capabilities. When food rationing had been implemented, he had been assured that American civilians were suffering even greater privations due to German U-boat successes in the Atlantic. The evidence before him now suggested that these explanations had been, at best, wishful thinking. Sergeant O'Brien's equipment told a story of industrial abundance that contrasted sharply with the improvised repairs and substitute materials that had become standard in German military production. His rifle appeared factory new. His boots showed no signs of the constant patching that had become necessary for German footwear, and his field pack contained what seemed to be unlimited supplies of items that had become precious commodities in wartime Germany. More American soldiers were now moving through the street, and Friedrich could observe their interactions with other German families. What he witnessed challenged every assumption he had formed about how occupying armies behaved. Rather than the systematic looting he had been warned to expect, he saw soldiers sharing rations, offering medical assistance to elderly residents, and showing particular consideration for children. One GI was helping an elderly woman clear debris from her doorway, while another was bandaging a cut on a young girl's hand with supplies from his own first aid kit. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The abundance these soldiers displayed was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the encounter. Friedrich had grown accustomed to scarcity as a fact of life, to carefully rationing soap, to saving every scrap of food, to repairing clothing until it was more patch than original fabric. The American soldiers seemed to operate in a completely different economic reality. They offered cigarettes freely, shared food without apparent concern for their own supplies, and treated items that would have been treasures in wartime Germany as disposable conveniences. Hans finally stepped forward and accepted the chocolate bar, his small hands trembling as he unwrapped it with the reverence of someone handling a religious artifact. The first bite brought tears to his eyes, and Friedrich felt his own throat tighten as he watched his son experience a pleasure that had been absent from their lives for so long. Sergeant O'Brien smiled and ruffled the boy's hair, a gesture so naturally paternal that it seemed impossible to reconcile with the image of American soldiers as heartless invaders. "You have children?" Friedrich managed to ask in his limited English, gesturing toward the sergeant's obvious comfort with Hans. O'Brien nodded and pulled out a worn photograph showing a young woman holding a toddler, both smiling in front of what appeared to be a well-maintained American home, complete with an automobile in the background. The normalcy of the scene, the evidence of a life untouched by bombing, rationing, or the constant fear that had defined German civilian existence, struck Friedrich with almost physical force. The photograph revealed aspects of American life that directly contradicted years of Nazi propaganda about the decadent, struggling nature of enemy societies. The woman in the picture was well-dressed and healthy-looking, the child appeared well-fed and happy, and the background suggested a level of material comfort that had been unknown to most German families even before the war.
If this was how ordinary American soldiers lived, what did that suggest about the productive capacity of the society that had equipped and supplied the massive military force now occupying German territory? As the afternoon progressed, more details emerged that reinforced Friedrich's growing sense that fundamental assumptions about the war had been incorrect. American supply trucks rumbled through Waldenburg in an endless procession, each vehicle loaded with equipment, food, fuel, and ammunition in quantities that seemed almost wasteful by German standards. Friedrich counted 17 trucks in the first hour alone, more vehicles than the entire German garrison in the area had possessed at the beginning of the year. The contrast with German logistics was stark and undeniable. For months, Friedrich had watched German units pass through Waldenburg with increasing signs of desperation. Soldiers with patched uniforms, vehicles held together with improvised repairs, and equipment that showed clear signs of being cannibalized from other sources. Many German units had been reduced to using horse-drawn transport for supplies, a regression that Nazi propaganda had spun as a return to traditional German values rather than acknowledging the underlying shortage of fuel in vehicles. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to possess unlimited motorized transport. Each vehicle appeared new or nearly new, with unpatched tires and factory-fresh paint. The drivers showed none of the careful fuel conservation that had become second nature to German operators. They left engines idling during stops and drove at speeds that would have been considered wasteful by German standards. The sheer abundance suggested an industrial capacity that rendered German production efforts almost insignificant by comparison. Hans had finished his chocolate bar and was now shyly accepting a second piece from Sergeant O'Brien, who seemed genuinely pleased by the child's obvious enjoyment. The interaction had attracted other German children in the neighborhood, and Friedrich watched as American soldiers began distributing candy and rations to a growing group of youngsters. What struck him most powerfully was the soldiers' apparent pleasure in these acts of generosity. They seemed to derive genuine satisfaction from feeding hungry children rather than viewing it as a burden or duty. This behavior pattern was being repeated throughout Waldenburg as American forces established their presence in the town. Rather than the harsh military occupation that Nazi propaganda had predicted, residents were encountering what appeared to be a systematic effort to address civilian suffering. American medics were treating German wounded, quartermasters were organizing food distribution for malnourished residents, and officers were working to restore basic services that had been disrupted by the fighting. The psychological effect on German civilians was profound and immediate. Friedrich found himself questioning not just specific claims about American behavior, but the entire framework of beliefs that had sustained him through years of increasing hardship. If the Nazi Party had been so fundamentally wrong about the nature of America and Americans, what other assumptions needed to be reconsidered? The question carried implications that extended far beyond military matters to touch on basic questions of political and social organization.
As evening approached and American forces settled into their temporary positions around Waldenburg, Friedrich observed interactions that continued to challenge his preconceptions. American soldiers were establishing their command post in the town hall, but rather than simply commandeering the building, they were coordinating with local officials to minimize disruption to civilian administration. German municipal workers were being retained in their positions, and American officers were seeking local input on immediate needs for medical care, food distribution, and infrastructure repair. The contrast with Soviet occupation policies, which Friedrich had heard about through refugee accounts, was striking. While Soviet forces were reported to be systematically stripping occupied territories of useful materials and treating German civilians with considerable harshness, the Americans seemed focused on stabilizing conditions and protecting civilian welfare. This difference suggested fundamental disparities in military doctrine, national resources, and underlying political values that had profound implications for post-war reconstruction. Hans fell asleep that evening with chocolate still on his lips, the first time in months that the boy had gone to bed with a full stomach. Friedrich sat beside his son's makeshift bed in their partially damaged home, trying to process the day's revelations.
The sound of American vehicles moving through the town continued into the night, a constant reminder of the massive logistical operation that was reshaping not just the military situation, but his understanding of the world itself. The encounter with Sergeant O'Brien had lasted perhaps 20 minutes, but its implications would reverberate through Friedrich's consciousness for years to come. In that brief exchange, the careful edifice of beliefs that had sustained him through 12 years of Nazi rule and 4 years of increasingly desperate warfare had begun to crumble. The chocolate bar offered to his son was more than an act of kindness. It was evidence of a fundamentally different approach to human relationships, military organization, and social responsibility. Tomorrow would bring new revelations as American occupation forces established permanent control over Waldenburg and its surrounding region. But the psychological transformation had already begun in that moment when a young American sergeant had knelt in a muddy street to offer chocolate to a hungry German child, shattering forever the carefully constructed mythology that had sustained the Third Reich's war effort. 25 years had passed since that March afternoon in Waldenburg when Sergeant Timothy O'Brien had knelt in the muddy street to offer chocolate to 8-year-old Hans Koller. Now, in the spring of 1970, Friedrich Koller stood in the same doorway, fully rebuilt after the war, watching his son Hans, now 33 and a successful engineer, load his own children into a gleaming Volkswagen Beetle for their weekly trip to visit their American grandfather. The transformation was complete, yet the memory of that pivotal moment remained as vivid as ever. Hans had grown up to marry Catherine O'Brien, Sergeant Timothy O'Brien's daughter, whom he had met during a cultural exchange program in 1962. What had begun with a chocolate bar shared between former enemies had blossomed into something neither Friedrich nor the young American sergeant could have imagined, a family bond that bridged 2 nations and 2 former enemy peoples. Friedrich's weathered hands, now 71 years old, still trembled slightly, not from fear or shock as they had that day in 1945, but from the profound emotion of witnessing a transformation so complete it seemed almost miraculous. The small Bavarian town of Waldenburg had evolved from a war-torn settlement of 2,847 desperate souls into a thriving community of 12,000 residents, many of whom worked for American companies that had established operations throughout the region. The Koller family business, which Friedrich had rebuilt with American assistance through the Marshall Plan, now employed 847 people and had branch offices in Detroit and Chicago.
Hans's success story was replicated throughout West Germany, where an entire generation had grown up with direct experience of American generosity and democratic values. The children who had received chocolate from American soldiers in 1945 had become the architects of the German economic miracle, carrying with them a fundamental understanding that former enemies could become partners, that abundance was possible through cooperation, and that democratic capitalism offered a path to prosperity that authoritarian systems could not match. Dr. Wilhelm Brennan, who had been the town's physician in 1945 and was now 91 years old, still maintained detailed records of the health improvements that had followed American occupation. The physical transformation was dramatic, he reflected in a recent interview with the Waldenburg Historical Society. But the psychological transformation was even more profound. Children who had been taught to fear and hate Americans learned instead to associate them with safety, abundance, and kindness. That lesson shaped an entire generation's approach to international relations. The documentation was extensive and undeniable. Infant mortality in Waldenburg had dropped from 127 per thousand in 1945 to 11 per thousand by 1950, directly attributable to American medical supplies and nutritional assistance. Average height for children born after 1945 had increased by 4 centimeters compared to those born during the war years. Educational opportunities had expanded dramatically, with American scholarship programs sending hundreds of young Germans to study in the United States, creating networks of personal relationships that strengthened diplomatic ties for decades. Perhaps most significantly, the transformation had been psychological and moral as well as material. Friedrich often reflected on how the encounter with American abundance had forced a complete reassessment of fundamental beliefs about human nature, social organization, and international relations. The revelation that prosperity need not come at the expense of others, that strength could be coupled with generosity, and that former enemies could become friends, had reshaped not just individual lives, but an entire nation's approach to the world. The contrast with Eastern Germany remained stark and instructive. While West Germany had experienced the Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s, East Germany, under Soviet influence, had struggled with chronic shortages, political repression, and economic stagnation. The different trajectories of the two German states served as a real-world experiment in the consequences of different political and economic systems, with the results visible to anyone willing to look honestly at the evidence. Hans had visited East Berlin in 1968, shortly before the construction of the Berlin Wall. His reports to his father had been sobering. "It's like visiting Germany in 1946, empty store shelves, people waiting in long lines for basic necessities, children who look underfed. But most disturbing was the atmosphere of fear. People were afraid to speak freely, afraid to express opinions, afraid to trust their neighbors. It reminded me of stories you told about life under the Nazis, Papa. Different ideology, same result. A society built on fear and scarcity, rather than hope and abundance." The wall itself had become a powerful symbol of these contrasting approaches. On the Western side, life flourished with economic opportunity, cultural freedom, and international cooperation. On the Eastern side, armed guards prevented people from seeking better lives elsewhere. The contrast could not have been more clear. One system trusted its citizens with freedom and rewarded them with prosperity, while the other imprisoned its citizens and kept them in poverty. Colonel O'Brien's grandchildren visiting from America played freely with Hans's children in the reconstructed streets of Waldenburg. Their games bore no trace of the national antagonisms that had once made such friendships impossible. They switched effortlessly between English and German, shared toys and treats without regard for nationality, and demonstrated in their innocent interactions the possibility of a world where artificial barriers between peoples had been dissolved. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the town's Memorial Park, constructed on the site where American forces had first distributed food to German civilians in March 1945. The memorial bore inscriptions in both English and German, in memory of the moment when enemies became friends, when abundance conquered scarcity, and when chocolate shared between children built bridges that bombs could never destroy. Friedrich's evening walks through this memorial park had become a ritual of reflection and gratitude. The bronze statue at the center depicted not a military victory, but the simple act of an American soldier offering food to a German child. Visitors from around the world came to see this monument to reconciliation, often leaving flowers or small tokens of appreciation for what it represented. The global implications of this transformation extended far beyond German-American relations. The success of post-war reconstruction in West Germany had provided a model for international cooperation that influenced American foreign policy for decades. The Marshall Plan, which had facilitated much of the economic recovery, became a template for development assistance programs worldwide. The principle that former enemies could become allies through generous assistance and patient cooperation had shaped American approaches to Japan, South Korea, and other former adversaries. Educational exchanges had multiplied these personal connections across millions of individuals. By 1970, over 100,000 Germans had studied in American universities, while thousands of American students had spent time in German institutions. Each exchange created personal relationships that reinforced political and economic ties for decades, making future conflicts increasingly unlikely and unthinkable.
The business relationships were equally important. German companies had established significant operations in the United States, while American corporations had become major employers in Germany. These economic interdependencies created powerful incentives for cooperation and peaceful conflict resolution.
War between such closely integrated societies would have been economic suicide for both sides. Hans's own career illustrated these new possibilities. As an engineer specializing in automotive technology, he had spent 2 years working for Ford Motor Company in Detroit, where his German training in precision manufacturing had been highly valued. His American colleagues had become lifelong friends, and his children considered Uncle Bob and Aunt Mary from Michigan to be as much family as their German relatives. The cultural exchange had flowed in both directions. American soldiers stationed in Germany had brought home wives, friends, and deep appreciation for German culture, history, and achievements. German immigrants to America had contributed their skills and perspectives to American communities. The result was not cultural homogenization, but rather a rich cross-pollination that strengthened both societies. Religious reconciliation had been equally important. The American soldiers who had occupied Waldenburg had included Catholics, Protestants, and Jews working together in common cause. This demonstration of religious tolerance had profound impact on German communities that had been poisoned by Nazi anti-Semitism. The reconstruction of Waldenburg Synagogue with American financial assistance and German labor had become a powerful symbol of moral renewal. Father Klaus Weber, who had served as Waldenburg's Catholic priest since 1943, had witnessed the entire transformation. Quote, "The Americans taught us that Christianity was about love, not hate. They showed us that people of different faiths could work together for common good. This was a lesson our community desperately needed after the poison of Nazi ideology." End quote. As Friedrich prepared for bed on this anniversary evening, he reflected on the path that had led from that moment of shocked disbelief in March 1945 to the peaceful prosperity of 1970. The transformation had not been automatic or easy. It had required courage from individuals willing to overcome decades of conditioning, wisdom from leaders committed to reconciliation over revenge, and patience from entire societies willing to build new relationships on the ruins of old hatreds. The chocolate bar that Sergeant O'Brien had offered to young Hans had been worth perhaps 5 cents in 1945. Its true value, however, had been immeasurable. It had represented a choice between perpetuating cycles of hatred and revenge or beginning the difficult work of building something better. The fact that American soldiers had consistently chosen generosity over vengeance, cooperation over domination, had made all the subsequent transformations possible. Hans tucked his own children into bed that evening, reading them stories in English that his American in-laws had sent him. Little Greta fell asleep clutching her chocolate just as her father had 25 years earlier, but in a world transformed by the choices made by brave individuals willing to see humanity in former enemies. Friedrich's final thought before sleep was a prayer of gratitude, not just for the material abundance that surrounded him, but for the profound lesson he had learned that day in March 1945. He had discovered that the most powerful force in human affairs was not hatred or fear, but the simple willingness of one person to show kindness to another, especially when that kindness crossed the artificial boundaries that divided human beings from one another. The chocolate had been consumed long ago, but its sweetness lingered still in the lives of children who would never know the bitterness of war, in the prosperity of communities built on cooperation rather than conquest, and in the friendship between nations that had once been enemies. It was a legacy sweeter than any confection and more enduring than any monument. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for cooperation, and new chances to choose generosity over selfishness. But tonight, Friedrich Koller slept peacefully in a world transformed by the simple human decision to share chocolate with a hungry child. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.